Tifa and or Aerith's affinity can increase if they wear a matching swimsuit style with Cloud. When I think about this, it's odd to call this particular section a choice, as I believe nothing in the game hints at this affinity increase. It just so happens by sheer luck of choosing matching swimsuits, or you having prior knowledge that this happens. What is up? It's MLW JRPG, and this video will explore the affinity system in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth from a unique perspective. A lot of you have various opinions and feelings about the affinity system. You may have gripes and complaints about it, and I get that, trust me, and there are aspects that you enjoy. But what I'm going to be talking about concerning the affinity system is whether or not there is an intended route that a player will take if they play the game mainly focusing on the main story. So this means minimum player agency and choice. The main story forces you to interact with specific characters at many points throughout the game, resulting in increased mandatory affinity. Please take note, again, this is concerning focusing only on the main story, with little to no interactions outside of the main story. Obviously, if the player is committing to doing as much side content as possible, using a guide, intentionally choosing 1-star options for a character, whilst choosing 3-star options for another, you have synergy skills that build up in combat and side quests. These would all change everything. Focusing mainly on the main story objectively examines the bigger picture without bias toward any character. However, it has flaws, as there are sections where you have to make a choice, but these are tiebreaker situations. An example of this would be the fight on the beach at Costa del Sol, which I'll definitely be discussing later in the video. It's better to look at this from a main story focused perspective only versus something like a 100% run or a completionist run. Okay, now let's get started. Before we do that, a quick shout out to Cola on Twitter. He put together a neat little chart about this last month, which inspired me to create this video with more details. Now, I mentioned exploring whether or not there is an intended route, or you could look at this as, say, the game's main narrative pushes toward a specific character, leading into the chapters 8 and 12 dates at the Gold Saucer. This means we're going to be looking at all the mandatory points in chapters 2 up to chapter 11 that result in affinity increases. There will be 2 categories for these main story beats that are linked to affinity. One will be called mandatory, meaning you, the player, will have to do this to progress the story. And the other will be called mandatory choice, meaning this has to be done to progress the story, but there is a choice of branching paths. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the 5 characters to whom affinity applies: Aerith, Tifa, Red 13, Yuffie, and Barret. We will go through each one and total the number of mandatory and mandatory choice points that they have over the course of the game leading up to chapter 11. Based on these totals, we will determine which character is favored or pushed along with the main story narrative. I'm going to kick this off with the world's greatest materia hunter, Yuffie. Yuffie's first and only mandatory event occurs at the start of chapter 7 when the party leaves Johnny's Seaside Tavern to start heading towards Mount Corel. Yuffie's affinity will increase after this scene, which references OG FF7 when you had to select the right answers to recruit her back when she was an optional party member. Also, toward the end of chapter 7, Yuffie has a mandatory choice section which happens at the Corel mines. If you decide to switch the tracks for the minecart route to the safe route, Yuffie's affinity will increase. The safe route is simply when the lever is pulled to the right, as shown here. Yuffie's final point where the main story can increase her affinity is in chapter 10 in Cosmo Canyon at the Torch. This is a mandatory choice event for Yuffie. The reason being why it's mandatory choice is because this section only requires you to interact with 3 of 4 party members that aren't aerith. So yeah, this is a dead giveaway for a mandatory choice event for Red 13, Tifa, and Barret, but we'll get to those later in the video. And that is it for Yuffie. Looking at the totals here, Yuffie has 1 mandatory event and 2 mandatory choice events. Next, coming in hot with her meteor strikes is Tifa Lockhart. Tifa's first mandatory event happens at the end at Under Junon in chapter 4. After the boss fight with Terra of the Deep, the party members go to their rooms at the end, each with their own affinity dialogue. Tifa, however, is the only party member who is required to speak to before the story advances here. The next and final mandatory event for Tifa happens during the Junon Parade. After Midgar's 7th Infantry is selected for the Presidential Commendation Award by Rufus, Tifa and Aerith's affinity will increase here. Now we get into mandatory choice events for Tifa, the first being during the beach cutscene. Tifa and/or Aerith's affinity can increase if they wear a matching swimsuit style with Cloud. When I think about this, it's odd to call this particular section a choice, as I believe nothing in the game hints at this affinity increase. It just so happens by sheer luck of choosing matching swimsuits, or you having prior knowledge that this happens. Another mandatory choice for Tifa happens right after the beach cutscene with her first mandatory choice, both in chapter 6 of course. Before the fight starts on the beach, the player has to choose to join Aerith and Barret on their left, or Tifa and Red 13 on the right. Obviously choosing the right will count as a mandatory choice toward Tifa here. Tifa's final mandatory choice event is at the Torch in chapter 10. Tifa totals 2 mandatory events and 3 mandatory choice events, so we can now eliminate Yuffie as being favored at this point, as Tifa now leads at the moment. Now we can move on to Daddy Barret. It's interesting to note ahead of time that Barret doesn't have any mandatory events. As a matter of fact, he's the only party member that doesn't. Barret's first mandatory choice event happens at the beach in chapter 6 before the fight on the beach. Of course, you'd have to select to join Aerith and Barret on the left here. The next mandatory choice for Barret is during the Corel Mine section in chapter 7. The route for the minecart has to be set to the risky route, and this is actually the default route it's set at, when the lever is set to the left. And once again, at the Torch in chapter 10 is the last mandatory choice for Barret. Barret totals in at 3 mandatory choice events now, so Tifa still leads as being favored. Now we have arrived at the lovely independent florist Aerith. Aerith's first mandatory event is here during chapter 2. You have to talk to Aerith before you go into the bookstore here in Calm, which is a main story objective. This then turns around into going on a date with Aerith at the clock tower as the next main story objective. Moving along here, Aerith has another mandatory event here in chapter 4 during the Junon Parade, and as I mentioned before, this always applies to both Aerith and Tifa. Aerith's first mandatory choice is during the beach cutscene in chapter 6. As I pointed out with Tifa earlier, this affinity increase only happens if Aerith and/or Tifa happen to be wearing the matching swimsuit with Cloud. And of course, another mandatory choice in chapter 6 here, the beach fight. You choose to go to the left, that's going to be Aerith and Barret. So obviously with Aerith, the mandatory choice would require you to go to the left. The third mandatory event for Aerith happens during chapter 9 in Gungaga, and that would be the sequence of events at Zack's parents' house. Aerith is the only party member in Gungaga that you must speak to that has affinity options in order for you to progress the main story. Once again, during chapter 10 in Cosmo Canyon at the Torch is a sequence where affinity increase can happen. However, Aerith is the sole party member you have to interact with to progress the story. You only have to speak to 3 of 4 of the other party members. That means one of them can miss out on getting an affinity increase, thus mandatory choice for them and not for Aerith. And we have yet another mandatory event for Aerith. This seems to be commonplace now. But this is the last one for Aerith. You have to talk to Aerith in Nibelheim before the main story progresses. So yes, this entire cutscene at the water tower with Aerith must be viewed along with the affinity options during it. Now that we have gone through all of Aerith's events, we can total them. Aerith has a grand total of 5 mandatory events, and she has 2 mandatory choice events. This will now easily place Aerith in the lead for mandatory affinity via the main story. And last, we have the bestest best boy there is, Red 13. Red's one and only mandatory event is during the start of Chapter 8 at the Gold Saucer. After you fight Dio in the 3D Brawler tutorial, you'll get an affinity increase with Red. Bet you didn't see this one coming. Yes, once again during Chapter 6, during the beach fight, of course you need to choose to go to the right, which has Tifa and Red 13. That's how you'll get this mandatory choice with Red. Last mandatory choice for Red, as it's the same with several other party members, is the torch scene. When we total up Red's events here, we can see that Red has a total of 1 mandatory event and 2 mandatory choice events. We can now see that based on the main story affinity increases, Aerith clearly has the most opportunities to increase through the main story, which then shows us that Aerith is favored to be chosen as the Chapter 12 Gold Saucer date over all of the other party members. Now, when you're looking at Chapter 8, that's not a clear-cut victory for Aerith. Before the Chapter 8 date happens, Tifa and Aerith both have a total of 2 mandatory events and 2 mandatory choice events up to that point. The other party members all have less than Tifa and Aerith at this point. So honestly, with the Chapter 8 date, it very much could be a coin flip on whether it's more likely to be Aerith or Tifa. However, when moving on to Chapter 12, Aerith has a total of 8 opportunities at infinity increases, whilst all the other party members have a total of 5 or less, again while looking at the main story affinity increases. Also, I wanted to point out just for fun that all party members get another mandatory affinity increase, but it happens at the end of No Promises to Keep. So this isn't relevant to the grand scheme of things considering my video here, as this happens after the Chapter 12 date companion has already been selected. I'll mention one more time that these findings only consider the mandatory main story beats that increase affinity. Yes, there are plenty of outside factors that affect affinity, but again, those are all optional and biased. I'll also mention that technically, the mandatory choice events do have bias involved with them as well, as you are forced to make a choice here, so it's likely it's going to come down to preference, but there is no way to not consider these options as they are forced with the main story narrative. Wrapping this up, in conclusion, it's pretty clear to see that Aerith has the most opportunities at main story narrative affinity increases, thus giving her a very likely chance to be chosen specifically for the Chapter 12 date at the Gold Saucer. Again, with the Chapter 8 date, as I said, that can literally be a coin flip. If you're still watching this video up to this point, it is very likely you are already subscribed to your boy MLWJRPG, but if you are not, make sure you hit that subscribe button and look forward to more content coming your way like this.